Want to make your own podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easy, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters. Here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I feel like I have an outlet for the creativity and ideas I want to share with the world. I recommend you give it a try. We all have a voice, so share it with the world. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app, or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started today. Welcome, everyone, to this mini episode of the Days of Noah podcast. I sat down with Rod Smith from the Millennial Mustard Seed podcast to do this mini episode and discuss something that came across my Twitter feed as, well, a centuries-old atheist objection to God. This is a question that needs answering. How does pain and suffering exist in the world if God is all-powerful and all-loving at the same time? It seems to be a paradox. Well, I think the answer to that is understanding how God's sovereignty and the free will that He's given us work together. And that's not an easy thing to understand, but I think as a basis of a starting point, we need to understand better how those things work together to know why the world is the way it is. So guys, leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy this episode. Share it with your family and friends. Get the word out about the Days of Noah podcast, as well as the Millennial Mustard Seed with Rod Smith. We thank each and every one of you out there for listening and being a part of this journey with us. Hey Rod from the Millennial Mustard Seed, this is Pete from the Days of Noah podcast. How are you, sir?
Doing well, man. We're going to get this thing recorded because somebody in the airways does not like this topic. So I'm actually excited for round 2 here.
Yeah, we had an unprecedented internet flash outage there, right? And then my local backup disappeared as well.
Yeah, my local backup is missing. So this has never happened before in this unique manner in 5 years of podcasting. This is the first time I've had this unique, literally wipeout mid-recording back. I have a local backup going right now too. It's just unbelievable. But yeah, so let's jump into it, man, because we were getting ready to move in the spirit and
right.
Get some things lined up here that's going to be edifying and tackle this huge question. So I'm going to go back and reread this question, Pete, and then let's just get back into it.
And let me just say this real quick, Rod, before you do that. We'll let the audience be the judge as far as if you guys think there was some spiritual opposition just now once you hear kind of what we're going to discuss. Not to talk it up too much, but it is about
an age-old question.
It's an age-old question challenging the authority of who God is, which is where Satan loves to attack. So yeah, why don't you jump in? This was a Twitter post that I saw, and I sent screenshots to Rod, so he's going to read this.
All right, I'll start with this first screenshot here. The paradox goes as follows. If God is willing to prevent evil but is not able to, then He is not all-powerful. If He is able to prevent evil but is not willing to, then He is not all good. If He is both willing and able to prevent evil, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? So, Pete, this is a paraphrase of a very ancient, age-old question. You want to fill us in on who asked this question originally from the old times?
Yeah, I was looking up just if it had a particular, title to this question or series of questions. And it actually did. It comes from the 3rd century BC from a guy named Epicurus. And he posed this question: if God is willing to prevent evil, but doesn't, is he actually good? Or if he doesn't want to, but he's able to, so it's basically this conundrum of, if he's incapable, but unwilling, what does that say about him? Or if he's willing, but incapable, what does that say about him? And if he's neither, well, maybe he's not really God. And so this has been a challenge that apparently to this day, a month ago, I saw a Twitter post, an atheist had posted this, and he posted it under a caption. You guys can Google this picture. Looks like out on the African prairie, a poor little starving child. Just by the frailty of the child, you could kind of come to that conclusion. And here's this vulture, 10 or so yards in the background looking for an easy lunch, it appears. And so just kind of throwing this at God's face, saying, look at the suffering that here is just one snapshot of suffering in the world. So God, either you don't care, but you could do something, but you don't care, or you care, but you just can't do anything. And either way, they seem to have a point against God. But the reason I brought this up to Rod, I wanted to do a mini episode on this, is because, I've done a fair bit of study on the topic of just how deterministic God is and how free will works. And there's a lot of theological systems that go back and forth between those things and try to wrestle with those questions that I won't get into. But I think when someone asks this question, and it's a good question, it deserves an answer. Unfortunately, I think a lot of Christians don't have a good answer. I think we need to understand the nature of God in order to answer this question. And one of the things about him is that he has chosen in his sovereignty, he's the one deciding in his sovereignty to limit himself to a degree. And he does this for a variety of reasons. He set up the world and the creatures that he made, the creation he made, he set up in a certain way with certain rules. There's spiritual realm rules. There's, giving mankind dominion over the earth rules. And so when I see suffering in the world, in large part, I say to myself, well, as much as we are willing to follow God's ways and let him in, then we see more of him because we are his ambassadors on earth. That's how, by and large, that's how he's chosen to represent himself in this world. Not that he doesn't intervene on his own. I'm sure he does on a daily basis in many ways we don't even realize. But by and large, we are his ambassadors. And so if the world doesn't see God, it's because of his children not acting how we're supposed to act. And if we decide that we want to live our own way and we don't want to let God into the equation, well, then evil gets a leg up. It's really this back and forth of what are you going to feed? What are you going to give power? And so I think this self-limiting nature that God has chosen to act upon in this way is he is going to let free will play out to a certain degree as far as he has determined. And once he sets up those rules, since the Bible says he does not change, he is not going to go back on the way he set out to accomplish things. Now, to me, that just makes him a bigger, more impressive God, because if he had to play both sides of the chessboard and he won, no one would be impressed. But if he can let the most powerful grandmaster, an AI, supercomputer compete against him in chess, and he can still win, that's what makes him God. Is the fact that he allows evil and free will to exist, and he will still accomplish what he wants to accomplish. So, it's basically this question is answered, this age-old question from 2,300 years ago. In my opinion, the way I answer it is, we need to understand that God is self-limiting because he has given dominion of this earth to mankind. And he's self-limiting in part because he wants genuine obedience and genuine love. Just like we don't want our child to, if we could give our child a pill that forever would make them love and be obedient to us, sure, it might be peaceful in the house every day, but deep down we know that love and that obedience is fake. It's robotic. And I think God is an idealist. He wants the highest level possible good, and he's willing to risk a lot to get it. So that's my answer to that question, is we need to understand it's not that God isn't omniscient. It's not that he doesn't care. It's that in general, he's given dominion to us, and it's what we do with it. And he is self-limiting in that way. Not that he can't, but because he has set it up in his sovereignty.
Yeah, and this is a big question. It's obviously an age-old question. So the way that I'm going to enter into this one is I'm going to lean towards the focus that God shows us in his word, which is the power of storytelling. There's plenty of examples of good stories in the Bible, but Joseph comes to mind. The thing about Joseph is he was guiltless before his brothers who betrayed him. He was brutally betrayed and sold into slavery. And he works his way from the bottom, finally becoming the head of the household of one of the generals, or somebody important in Egypt, and is betrayed again by, I think, his Potiphar's wife. Yeah, he was ruling Potiphar's house. And after spending some time in prison for something he didn't do wrong, God is webbing and weaving behind the scenes, in my opinion, this very long range, limitless, filtered plan, because of the willingness of what Joseph's heart looked like before God. You see, God doesn't see the outward appearance, he sees the heart. So when he knew he's seen Joseph, he's like, I can bring what I want to pass into succession because of a child like Joseph. Goes through this betrayal, becomes a slave. Most of us complain about just these simple things in life that, heck, we probably brought it on ourselves. But here's a guy who's just not perfect, not guiltless, not blameless, but in the things he was betrayed on, the word shows us that he was blameless in this betrayal. He did nothing to invoke it. And by the time he finds himself interpreting two dreams of two other, let's just say, laborers for Pharaoh in a jail cell, he still dishes out grace, the same measure, honestly depicting the dreams of the guy who was Pharaoh's baker and the guy who was Pharaoh's cup holder. They both had drastically different outcomes, but Joseph, once again, genuinely, honestly, used a gift that God gave him in the lowest position possible, without mumbling, without complaining. And eventually this leads the cupbearer to remind Pharaoh in one of his hardest seasons as to not understanding how to interpret this dream. The wise men of the land, the mages of the land, nobody could interpret this dream for Pharaoh, but the cupbearer remembered being in that dark and low and that damp and that dirty place where a servant of the one true God had accurately and faithfully depicted his dream and gave him resolve. And he mentions Joseph's name to Pharaoh. And now this lands Joseph from the lowest pit into the courts of the highest power in the land. And the reason I bring this story up, and obviously I paraphrased, and I just wanted to hit a couple climaxes. I'm hoping majority of you know what this story actually entails. I hope you've read it. If you haven't, well, now's the time. But the power of this story that God is showing us, and the outcome of Joseph's climactical line as the brothers who sold him into slavery return to the very land that God has lifted him out of the pit from and given him the position as co-ruler of the land. And Joseph says this to his brothers: though you have intended this for evil against me, the Lord my God has used it for good. And this is like a heart-wrenching story. Really, I mean, if you guys get into it and just be like a child again, just be like a little kid and open up the Bible and read this story about Joseph. Oh, because God uses this amazing power of storytelling throughout the word to show us his long-range reach, as well as how he limits himself. But through that limitation, the filtration of that I would agree with, is through the dominion and kingdom of men that he has clearly made in his likeness and his image and established here on this earth with dominion. And there's only a couple Josephs for many other citizens of Egypt, right? There's not many men of great moral and great character. Now, why? That's another podcast episode. But what I would say to the audience is, I love Pete's response. I agree with almost everything you said to an extent, but I wanted to use the power of storytelling that stirred up inside of me, because that is how God responds to the age-old questions like this. Because Joseph probably asked himself that question a dozen or more times every month that went by as he found himself in the pit, knowing he did nothing wrong. There was no bad ill will or connivingness to any of the deals he found that fell short on, to the extent of him being imprisoned and enslaved. I'm sure he pondered, God, are you really just? Are you really righteous? Are you really in control? I'm sure he doesn't confront God like that according to what the word shows us. But he's a man. This is a shadowing of what Christ would be like, but Joseph isn't Christ. Typology possibly could be argued, but let's get it back to the childlike perspective here. One story that God shares with us through his word to help us understand these big questions, because they're spiritual questions, they're emotional questions. And we shouldn't always have a perfect response for some of these questions. There is going to be some wonder and mystery to it all. But God, we cannot forget, has a long-range plan that he works out through the least willing candidates to the outside eye. People would look upon the lowly things and they would never imagine what God is intending to accomplish to that which has been rejected and abandoned and forgotten. And that's the power of storytelling. So in a nutshell, Pete, the way I view a question like, is God good? Is God just? I think his contention is beyond comprehension. I think the love that he depicts to us in the word is beyond our grasp. Hence the reason he says, I work in and through you to cause my will to come about. These are big questions. And it's going to take some time for even me to just bask in that a little bit more, like more. And I would expect you guys as listeners to have a secret conversation with God if this is a troubling topic for you.
And let me add one last little thing to kind of cap off what you said about God using things for good. That doesn't mean that the event itself is good, is that he's able to bring something good out of anything. And there's been something like 20 billion people that have lived the last, 6,000 or so years, something like that. And we have no idea all of the stories of pain and suffering. We hear a lot about them today because of the age of information, but there's a lot of stories we haven't heard. But that I bring that up to say, I think that in every dark situation, whether it's Nazi Germany concentration camp or an SRA satanic ritual abuse survivor, or what was the guy that lost like half his family that wrote, "It is well with my soul." I think God has someone who has experienced every suffering possible out there. And he has someone who is a believer in him, who has gone through that, so that we can speak to the world and have a witness to a person with the same type of background who isn't a believer. And we can say how God has brought us through it and what he has taught us. So I think that's one of the reasons he allows things to play out with suffering and pain and free will, is so that he can show the world how he can redeem situations that seem impossible. And if he gave Christians a special bit of protection that the world noticeably saw, if we had 20% less, marriages fall apart, or 20% less or untimely deaths because we were Christians or something, the world would get a chip on their shoulder, and rightly so. No, God doesn't care about us. You're the special ones. No, we go through the same stuff, and that doesn't mean we don't have blessings and protection. It doesn't mean we don't have eternal life. But we go through the same stuff, and I think God lets us go through it so we can speak his truth to someone on the other side who's felt that same thing.
Wise words, Pete. That's deep, deep stuff, man. Deep stuff.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah. And this is definitely the kind of question that needs to come up. It needs to be a heartfelt conversation that really we digest in bite sizes, because it can trigger pain and trauma, or remembrance of difficult things. And we're all going through this healing process. We're all going through this together. So being a little bit more vulnerable, I think Carly said this recently. She said, vulnerability is also a major tool that God uses too. So the enemy, a lot of the times, wants to make you feel this is a vulnerable question. This is going to expose the fact that Rod didn't have the best answer and he just wanted to go use a Bible story, whatever people are thinking, because I'm thinking in the confidence of what God showed me in the moment. And it was the comfort of knowing that in his word, he has brought a peace and a comfort that through this power of storytelling that he's delivered to me, it has given me the confidence to speak this way in front of one person or a million, in front of princes, kings, judges, or the guy down the street. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not discriminating. God is good. But we all have a vulnerability. And I think that if we took anything away from what Pete told us here tonight, and the story that I reminded you guys of Joseph, God's long range plan can really surprise us if we continue to follow him, regardless of what it looks like on the outside, regardless of what they say about us, what happens. He's good and faithful. And I believe that. And Pete, it's always an honor to chop it up with you. I know that this is more heartfelt. There's not as much laughter or any fun, spontaneous kind of questions that came out of this, but this needs to take place. This is important. This is why I agreed to do it. This is why I believe that we can lead by example and stir up the fact that, hey, we're gonna charter places that most people aren't willing to go. And it doesn't mean we live in this space, but it does mean that we're man enough and confident enough in who God is creating us to be to enter into this kind of space. So hopefully that's helpful.
And the word tells us, let us have an answer for the hope that we have. Right? So when you hear those hard questions, those good questions in a lot of cases that atheists have, let's not be afraid to engage those, even if we don't know off the top of our head what to say, because there are good answers out there.
Exactly.
And the wonderful thing about truth is it can stand up to scrutiny. It will
stand all on its own, right?
all on its own.
Yeah.
So do the work, because when you're defending God's truth, you can't fail. You just need more. You might need more knowledge to know how to answer that, but go get that knowledge because it's out there. Truth will stand up to scrutiny. I want to leave one last thing, Rod, because kind of you brought it home with people that are probably feeling a lot of personal things where they don't want to talk philosophical. They want to sit in silence like Job and say, don't speak to me. I just need to sit. A book that I went through last year that I would recommend is called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament. It's by Mark Vroegop, Vroegop. And it's all about understanding how lament and learning how to do so, especially in the Psalms, where David is crying out in all of his struggle. And you see him over and over turning it back towards faith and praise. So it's not just a rant or a venting. It's doing that, but then turning it into a faith building. So I highly recommend that book.
1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. Well, that's it for this little mini episode here. It's deep. It's an emotional roller coaster. Pete, I love the fact that you are a driving force to cover the chasm on these deeper and harder questions a lot of the times, because we weep, we cry, we're up, we're down. It's just like the Psalms. A lot of the times, it's just like David's story. So I'm hoping this mini episode is helpful. Pete, some final words as we close out here.
Yeah, just echo that. Good to be with you, Rod. And just pray a blessing over everyone listening. That, man, sometimes God's answers take years. And as we've had Tim Benz on the show a few times, he says God often answers in actions and things that play out, not in words. And so it's not just a yes or no, or it's how he'll show you the answer, and stick with it. Because the more general revelation that you accept from God, the more specific and deeper he will take you. But you gotta open yourself up. If you're at that point where you're just accepting the very slightest little consideration of God, he will reveal more to you if you keep that open.
And that's the echo of what a relationship looks like. When you start to relate with your Creator and have an intimate relationship, because that's key. And that's it for this mini episode. We got love and respect for you guys. We covet your prayers, and we ask you guys to leave us that 5-star rating and review. That helps us reach one more thirsty soul. That helps us reach one more person who has questions, who they want to feel like they fit in somewhere. Well, that might be with us. So share this episode. Coming to you from southeastern Pennsylvania. Goodbye.